Fear is a nautically themed horror game that was published by Ubisoft as part of their original mandate to make actually cool and interesting games. This mandate no longer exists. Before the advent of the open world to-do list template that the company would grow to love so much, they actually put thought and effort into making each one of their releases unique and different from one another, meaning they were putting out things like platformers, adventure games, stealth games, tactical shooters, and in this case, a survival horror game. Released in 2005 when the genre had entered the terminal stages of its decline in popularity, Cold Fear is a title that fully encapsulates the style's transition from the slower-paced Forerunners into whatever Resident Evil 6 was trying to be. On the cusp of the genre's resurrection, let's take a look back at one of the original titles from the end of the genre's heyday. Bundle up though, because we're going to the Arctic for this one, and that means we're dealing with... Hey, the last video got like 1 billion views, that's pretty neat. Being for real though, the performance of the last video was mind-blowing, so I want to thank everyone who subscribed from that, and I hope you'll enjoy this one just as much. We're pivoting from shooters to survival horror games for this one though. As I said in my video on Cannibal Abduction, classic survival horror games were one of the types of games that were most near and dear to my heart when I was growing up. From the release of Resident Evil in '96 to Resident Evil 4 in '05, this style of interactive entertainment experienced its golden age. While Resident Evil wasn't the first survival horror game, it's kinda like what Halloween did for slasher films in that it basically solidified all the various disparate elements of prior entries in the genre into an identifiable set of gameplay tropes that would serve as a blueprint for everything going forward. While Resident Evil was the undisputed king of the genre, there were several other successful heavyweights in the arena. I'm talking about stuff like Alone in the Dark, which came before Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, Dino Crisis, all that good stuff. If this type of game was your thing, you were eating good back in those days. What's that saying though? All good things? Well, that rang true here like with anything else. While this type of game was going strong from the late 90s to early 2000s, by the middle part of the decade, the winds in the industry began to change direction. Resident Evil began to shift towards a more action horror-oriented approach. Silent Hill fell into flux after Konami arbitrarily disbanded Team Silent and began assigning the series to other dev teams. Fatal Frame faced declining sales in the West and announced that the series' 4th entry would only see release in Japan. Capcom took Dino Crisis into fucking space for some reason. 2 separate Alone in the Dark games were cancelled, and a 3rd one was going through a troubled development cycle, and the myriad standalone entries into the genre failed to take off and establish themselves, including the one we're talking about today, Cold Fear. Cold Fear was developed by Darkworks, a French studio that was the same team behind Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare, Atari's attempt to modernize that series and bring it into competition with Resident Evil. Cold Fear actually began its development before that game though, originally under the title 1906 An Antarctic Odyssey. It was pitched as a kind of horror take on the works of Jules Verne, an early sci-fi author whose work would later serve as a template for the steampunk genre. When they got the chance to work on Alone in the Dark, the game got put on hold. After The New Nightmare, 1906 was rebooted, this time under the name USS Antarctica, and was targeted for a release on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox consoles. Also teased under the name Lost Mantis, the project took a drastic shift in direction, dropping the steampunk setting and instead adopting a more futuristic look and shifting the tone from one of exploration and discovery into an action horror story that was compared to disaster movies. Despite their former ambitions as a competitor to Resident Evil, this game was actually slated to be published by Capcom, though they later pulled the plug on it for reasons that were never revealed to the public. Darkworks still really wanted to make a horror game set in the freezing fucking cold though, so they retooled the general idea of a Resident Evil style game in the snow into a 3rd iteration of the project that we now know as Cold Fear. This time around they basically dropped all the sci-fi stuff entirely and went for something that was just set in the plain old boring modern day. No steam-powered airship or futuristic research vessel. This is now a rusty-ass Soviet surplus whaling ship that probably wouldn't have even passed a safety inspection in the 70s. The change in context of the setting was accompanied by a pretty big shift in the direction of the gameplay, since we were in '05 now and Resident Evil 4 had just come out, so everyone was scrambling to get an over-the-shoulder camera in their games. I'm actually not sure how much Resident Evil 4 impacted the development, since they both came out in the same year, but I guarantee you that the aiming system was a late addition. One of the biggest goals in the development was to make the ship feel like an actual ship, Since the game is set during a big-ass storm, the developers create a new engine just for the game that was capable of virtually mimicking the rolling of a sea vessel in response to rough waters. This was intended to add both a sense of immersion, but also add extra difficulty to the game's combat, since now in addition to having to reorient yourself after getting jump-scared by a zombie, you also have to contend with your aiming going all over the goddamn place since the boat's rocking back and forth constantly. To help with this commitment to detail, the team also went about the gargantuan task of creating a metric fuckload of extra animations for every character in the game to accommodate the constant changes in position and stance that would be brought about by all this. Developer estimates were that the NPCs each had about 100 additional animations than usual, and the player character had as many over 300. I can imagine the animators were counting the hours of sleep they got that year on one hand. To top it all off, not only do the characters react to the wave, but so do objects on the boat. Though this is mostly a back-of-the-box talking point, since I only remember one actual spot in the game where props also swayed back and forth. If this sounds like a cool system, that's because it is. The immersion levels are cranked up to 12,000 because of this, and it adds an extra level of tension to the combat, especially when you factor in that particularly violent waves can nearly upend the whole boat and send both you and your adversaries sliding across the deck and potentially into the ocean. So, ambitious gameplay mechanics, multiple iterations on the game's vision, and a team of dedicated enthusiasts who love what they were doing and had big plans for the future of the genre they were making games in. Boy, it sure would be sad if this game sold like shit and led to Darkworks getting demoted to a support studio. Oh, that's what happened? Neato, guess I'll just throw myself overboard then. That's all for the end of the video though, when it's time to get depressed about how much this industry fucking sucks. For now, we're gonna enter the narrative of my own personal encounter with this game. So I first heard about this game back in either 04 or 05, shortly after it was announced. My parents had just started letting me play the Resident Evil game, so I had already entered the world of survival horror at that point and fallen pretty quickly in love with it. I was in 5th grade, and one of my other friends who was into video games brought that month's copy of Game Informer or whatever to lunch, and we were reading through it and came across a brief article about this game. I remember thinking the screenshot looked cool, and the guy previewing it compared it directly to Resident Evil, so it really caught my eye, but I was a kid and money was tight, and my parents were understandably selective with what M-rated games they were letting me play at the time, so I don't think I ever really pushed for them to get it or rent it from Blockbuster. Also, fun fact, I would later stop being friends with that kid because he didn't like me or want to hang out with me a few months later after he got in trouble for punching me in the face after I made a joke about Green Day. Apparently I was somehow the bad guy in that scenario. Whatever, I finally bought it on Steam a few years back, but like is becoming a running theme on this channel, I never got around to playing it until a week ago when I recorded my playthrough for footage for this video. So from here on out, this is my story with this game and how my journey through a dilapidated whaling vessel stranded in the middle of the Arctic. You know the drill at this point. The game came out over 15 years ago, so how's it fucked up on modern systems? Fortunately, not too badly. It doesn't have any option for a 1920 by 1080 resolution, but I downloaded a fan patch off a Steam guide that fixed the issue with no extra hassle and didn't saddle me with any computer viruses, that I can notice anyway. Pre-patch, the footage looked like this. I'm not really a tech guy, so I don't freak out about graphical settings all that much, but you can see how that makes for a problem when you're playing to have other people watch your gameplay. Also, I'm realizing now I should have put a headphone warning because this game is loud as shit in my editing software and I can't do anything about it for some reason.
These old Russian whalers all stink to high heaven.
Alright, now that everybody needs a cochlear implant, let's move on to the setup of the narrative. The year is 2005, the protagonist is a Dollar General brand Leon S. Kennedy, the location is the Arctic, and the cutscenes are FMV, at least sometimes. For reasons that are never really elaborated upon, a team of SEALs boards a Russian whaling vessel armed to the teeth with all this badass future soldier type gear, but then gets promptly fucked up by nefarious entities that at present remain unseen. Our boy, Tom Hansen, no relation to Chris Hansen, not in this game anyway, is a Coast Guardsman who gets called and told to explore the ship and find the SEALs. He boards the ship at a different location from the rest of his team, which is really convenient because they all get eaten and now he's on his own. Gameplay loop time. Cold Fear plays like a simplified form of Resident Evil Code Veronica, basically. Fixed camera angles, which serve to heighten the tension by obstructing the player's vision and create a sense of claustrophobia as you navigate the ship's cramped interiors. Two big differences between this game and Code Veronica though. Difference 1 is that there's over-the-shoulder aiming, like in Resident Evil 4, complete with a laser sight and everything. This gives you a level of extra precision, which helps because the enemies tend to be fairly mobile. Difference 2 is that there's a much heavier focus on action, which has led to the survival elements being simplified. There's no inventory management, instead you can carry every gun you pick, have a fairly generous but not crazy amount of ammo you can carry for each one, and health items are used instantly upon interacting with them. This is an amount of streamlining that genre purists may start seeing red at, but I don't personally mind it too much since it's congruent with the game's vision of a more action-focused experience. As a survival horror game, though, what are you trying to survive against? Here's where one of my only big issues with this game manifests, since the variety of monsters to get mangled by is kind of lacking. You initially go up against quite possibly the scariest monsters of them all, disgruntled Russian sailors armed with MP5s who just found out that you don't know what hard base is. They shoot at you with guns, but are pretty easy to dispatch and only appear at a few points in the game owing to the fact that most of them have either been eaten or turned into monsters. The beings they've been transformed into form the bulk of the enemies you encounter in-game. They're these zombie things that come out with meat cleavers that apparently were just lying around everywhere, and they can only be permanently killed by headshots. What's turning these Ruskies into the reanimated are the next enemy type, these great value facehuggers called exocells that are a species of aquatic parasitic organism that takes over a host body and turns them into homicidal revenants. They're small and can be kind of hard to hit, but they die in like 2 shots with a pistol, so they're not too bad. It's a good thing that fighting these two monster types is fun, because that's all you get for like 90% of the game. There's these dog-like mutants that show up like twice and take 80 trillion shotgun blasts to kill, and the Charger from Left 4 Dead comes into play towards the end, but other than that, the gameplay loop with regards to combat is going to see you killing these two things on repeat for about 7 hours. It didn't bother me, I still thought the game was great, but monster variety is something that is always a huge plus in survival horror games. In fact, the genre kind of relies on it to keep the player scared of what else they could run into, so it's definitely a negative point against the game, I think. Despite the increase in emphasis on action, this is still survival horror at heart, so a lot of your time is going to be spent on exploration. The ship is really neat to wander around in, and the atmosphere in this game is pretty good. Some of the scares got me, and the whole thing has this cold and spooky vibe that reminded me a lot of The Thing. Plus, the whole mechanic with the ship rocking back and forth was really cool and added a neat twist to combat and navigation. However, this leads to my second main issue with this game. The ship section is only actually the first half of the game, because at the middle point, you crash into an oil rig, which is the setting for the game's latter portion. As an environment in which to get spooked and shoot zombies, it still works, and I still enjoyed exploring it, but it kind of forgets about the whole ocean waves affecting positioning and movement mechanic that was such a huge selling point of the game and such a highlight of the first half. Overall, it's still got some cool moments, with the highlight for me personally being the section where you explore an underwater lab, which is where some scientists were experimenting on the exocells. The only other real complaint I have about the oil rig section is that I feel like it's less appealing from a visual standpoint. For something released in 2005, this game looks really good and it runs like a dream. I'm gonna go off on a bit of a side rant here, but I feel like games that look like this sort of validate a complaint that I have with a lot of modern games. I feel like the industry leans too much towards attempting to make things as photorealistic as possible now at the expense of everything else. Devs seem to really underestimate the importance of art style, lighting, and a stable frame rate. If you can get these 3 things nailed down, then it doesn't really matter how many polygons your models have, or how much you use chromatic filtered tessellation with a side of RTX generated God rays powered by Congolese blood diamond infused processors. If games honestly just stayed like this graphically and never got better, I would have been fine with that, especially since I feel like that means the damn things would actually have a better turnout rate, and that way we'd see less games that take 8 years, $200 million, and 800 people to develop. Side rant over, let's talk about the story. So the general way it plays out is that Tom finds himself thrust in the middle of a conspiracy where 2 separate factions are vying for possession of the exocells, the CIA and the Russian Mafia. The oil rig and the whaling vessel were basically both projects undertaken by the mob, referred to in-game as the cartel, that kind of stumbled upon the exocells by accident. The Mafia thought they could use the exocells as weapons against their enemies, so they muscled a bunch of scientists into studying them and hired a bunch of mercenaries to guard both the rig and the boat. As is entirely expected, this goes wrong, the exocells break out, kill everyone, cue potential disaster for mankind. There's not really a huge cast of supporting characters here. The only other character that is involved with the game's story for any real amount of time is a woman named Anna, who is the daughter of the head researcher, a guy named Kamsky. She's basically the game's deuteragonist. The story culminates with a boss fight on the helipad of the oil rig, where you fight Kamsky himself. He's basically invincible, so the first half of the fight is you trying to piss him off so Anna can plant C4 to blow shit up, and then the second half is where you let him pick you up so you can shoot him in the face. This is actually a fairly difficult boss fight, or at least it was for me because I went into it with almost no health, but it's pretty fun. It requires some reflexes, some attack pattern memorizing, it's engaging, and it felt like an accomplishment to beat it. After Kamsky croaks, Tom and Anna fly away, and Tom makes like the most insensitive joke ever.
Papa, I'm sorry.
Goodbye, Papa.
Credits roll and we get to listen to a Marilyn Manson song because it was the mid-2000s, which was probably the height of his career. That's where the story of Cold Fear ends. It was a one title that sold like shit and never really had a chance at a sequel. I looked online and couldn't find anything anywhere that indicated that a follow-up ever even entered the conceptual stages, so we can assume Ubisoft had zero intention of ever pursuing that. One thing I did find that was interesting is that some solo dev is trying to do a fan remake. He made a couple of posts about it on Reddit that showed off some renders and early recreations of the ship in a few of its rooms, but this is all in a strictly unofficial capacity and I have no idea if he's still working on it. The company that originally produced Cold Fear, Darkworks, met the same sad end that a lot of studios do. After the release of Cold Fear, they began work on a new game, a survival-focused first-person game called Alive, that had a pretty disastrous development and was eventually handed over to Ubisoft Shanghai, who retooled the game into I Am Alive and released it in 2012 to mixed reviews. After that fiasco, Darkworks started working on a survival horror first-person shooter called Black Death that was in development for about a year and made it to the prototype stage before Ubisoft pulled the plug and shuttered the studio. Sucks because it seemed pretty cool. I like the visual style and the concept sounds intriguing. Okay, small correction. I did some more research and Ubisoft didn't cancel Black Death actually. Darkworks had gone independent at that point and was working on several different game concepts in order to try and get attention from publishers, with Black Death being the one that got the farthest along and seemed the most likely to actually see a release. I couldn't find exact details of what happened, but I can assume that the lack of releases was eating into their finances and they just ran out of money. Last little cool thing, there's actually a playable demo that got leaked onto the internet a while back, so if you want to see what could have been for yourself, you actually have an opportunity to, something that cannot be said for most canceled games. Another cool demo you can play is for an upcoming indie horror game called Mother Hub. That was a pretty slick fucking transition, wasn't it? It's not a sponsorship, I'm giving this shout out here because I'm actually helping to work on the game in a very limited capacity. A majority of the work is being done by a guy named Seth O'Dale, who has sought to make a horror-themed FPS that's heavily inspired by Half-Life and Doom 3. I personally get a lot of System Shock vibes from it, but apparently he's never played that, which is disgusting, and he should fix that. Anyway, he's got a demo out on Steam, and it would really help him out if you went and checked it out. Since I've helped a little bit with the game, I'm probably not going to make a video on it since that's kind of a conflict of interest, but the dude's been grinding on this thing for 8 years now, and I wanted to help expand its audience as much as I can. In case you're wondering what I did, I'm a lead tester, which means occasionally he sends me a level or something, and I play it and tell him what's fucked up about it, and I also did a tiny amount of writing, just a handful of audio logs you can find in-game, nothing extensive. I mean it when I say it, like 99% of the shit you're seeing on the screen right now is the product of one man. So that's the plug for Mother Hub out of the way, and that's the video for Cold Fear out of the way. While it may have failed to establish itself as a contender for the crown of survival horror, I think it still serves as a fun overall experience that can be a trip down memory lane for anyone who's pining for the horror games of old and still waiting on stuff like Holston and Conscript to come out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to go write a fan theory that this game is actually a sequel to the Titanic movie. I'm a hipster, so I mean the old one, or that animated movie that JonTron talked about. I don't know, still working on it. Hey everybody, if you made it this far into the video, I just want to say thanks, it means a whole lot. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all your standard YouTube outro stuff that you always hear. And other than that, I'll see y'all in the next video. Goodbye.